The Lufthansa Heist. The money was already in the building. It had arrived in layers. Canvas sacks dragged off planes, locked pouches from Frankfurt, jewelry cases moving under paperwork and routine. In the cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy Airport, the sound never fully stopped. Forklifts backing up, metal wheels rattling over seams in the concrete, phones ringing on desks with coffee rings burned into the finish. Even after passenger terminals had gone quiet, the freight side kept its own hours. Winter pressed at the loading doors. The air that came in carried jet fuel, damp cardboard, cold iron. Inside the vault area, the temperature held steady, fluorescent and hard. A guard sat through the night shift with a radio nearby and a line of forms to sign. Men in work jackets moved in and out with practiced boredom. Cash shipments passed through the same hands as crates of machine parts and luggage that had missed connections. The difference was not in the motion, it was in the paper clipped to the outside. Louis Werner knew that building from the inside. He worked cargo. He knew which nights were heavy, which supervisors checked too carefully, which ones let time slide if the forms matched. He also carried gambling debts that did not stay private. The men he owed were not patient men. Elsewhere, in the back of a bar where the windows held cigarette haze even before noon, Jimmy Burke listened more than he spoke. He had the habit of keeping his hands still while other men talked themselves into mistakes. On the table in front of him, a drink left a ring that dried and darkened and was covered by another. He was not an airport man. He was a man who understood that a place could be robbed long before anyone entered it, if the right person inside started naming doors. That was the first pull in this case. The money was not hidden in a distant bank. It was stacked in Queens, inside a cargo building connected to the runways, guarded by routine and the belief that routine was enough. The first problem was access. The vault could not be hit blind, not a place like this. The cargo terminal ran on timing, keys, combinations, and the habits of specific men. If the crew arrived without knowing who would be there, which door opened first, how long the transfer from office to vault took, they would be standing in the wrong hallway with guns and no clock left. The solution began with Werner. He provided the shape of the place, which employee would be on duty, which supervisor could be counted on to cooperate if pressure reached him through the right channel, which night's Lufthansa cash had a reason to be thick in the vault. He did not arrive as a planner with diagrams and speeches. He arrived as a weak point that kept talking because the men around him had made silence expensive. What was said in those rooms has never been fully confirmed, but what followed shows a crew building from detail, not appetite. Phone numbers were gathered, schedules fixed in memory. The role of each employee on the night shift was measured against force. A warehouse became a sequence. Door, office, guard, vault, exit. The floor sat inside the solution. Werner was useful because he was under pressure. That also made him unstable. A man giving up the inside of his workplace because he has to is a man who can shake later, forget later, tell the wrong person too much later. The crew accepted that because the alternative was guessing. Commitment came when a date was chosen and vehicles were arranged. Once the cars were assigned and masks prepared, this was no longer a conversation in the back of a bar. It was an appointment. The second problem was time. Cargo terminals are full of delays, but armed men cannot afford them. Once inside, the crew would have minutes, not an hour. They had to control the employees, open the vault, carry out sacks of currency and jewelry, and get clear before police response closed the roads around the airport. A large score creates its own drag. Money is heavy. Boxes are awkward. Men under guns do not always move well. The solution was compression. They would not wait for the vault to be opened by chance or by ordinary procedure. The employees would be forced to do it. The guard would be taken first. Others would be gathered quickly and restrained. The supervisor with the combination would be made to walk the crew through the sequence. Vehicles would be staged close enough for fast loading. Once out, the stolen property would move again, away from the first vehicle, away from anything tied to the airport. Here, the weakness was smaller and, in the moment, easier to dismiss. One of the escape steps depended on follow-through after the robbery. A van used in the operation had to disappear. Not later in the week, not after dawn, immediately. One vehicle left in the wrong place could become a witness that never forgot. The crew still committed. Masks were secured. Weapons assigned. Drivers fixed. Werner had given them the night. The airport would give them the rest if they moved quickly enough. The clock started before midnight. Cold sat low over the service roads around the cargo area. Runway noise came in bursts, then dropped away. Security on that side of the airport depended on familiarity. Vehicles belonged if they looked as if they belonged. Men crossing concrete in work clothes did not invite the same attention as men approaching a bank in broad daylight. Beat one. A guard at the Lufthansa cargo building was taken under control outside and brought inside at gunpoint. The crew moved with him through the first door. Their entry was not explosive, no alarms blaring, no broken glass. They entered the way insiders had taught them to enter, by seizing the person the building already trusted. Inside, employees were rounded up one by one. Plastic cuffs, tape. Orders given fast. The office phone lines and the rhythm of the room were taken away at the same time. A man seated at a desk was no longer a worker on a shift. He was part of the mechanism that had to be held in place. The complication came immediately. Not every employee was where the plan expected him to be, not at the exact moment. Small delays in a robbery are not small. A man walking back from a restroom or a loading bay can turn a clean sequence into noise. The decision under pressure was to keep pushing inward. The crew did not stop to perfect the scene. They used the men they had, forced the next door with the next body, and compressed the uncertainty by moving faster. Status check. The building was under control, but only if the pace held. The vault still stood closed. Beat 2. The supervisor was brought to the vault area. Metal door, combination lock. The room carried a cooler silence than the office outside, thickened by concrete and money that had no reason to exist in one place except transit. Hands were made to work, dials turned, another barrier opened, sacks and packages were in view now, the object of all the preparation suddenly reduced to items that had to be lifted. The action turned physical, canvas bit into fingers, boxes scraped shins, jewelry pouches and currency sacks were hauled toward the exit in relays. This was not elegant, it was labor, and labor under a gun has its own rhythm, short breaths, shoes grinding over grit, someone dropping one side of a load and being made to pick it up again. The complication was scale. There was more there than the body handles easily, more cash than quick carrying wants, more temptation to take one bag too many. Every extra second expanded the chance of interruption. The call was made to keep loading. Enough had already been taken to make the job historic, but enough remained to seduce men into risk. They chose more. The crew kept hauling. Status check. The vault was open. The money was moving. The clock was burning. Beat 3. The first loads reached the vehicle. Rear doors open. Cold air hitting warm hands damp from effort. Bags shoved in, stacked, shoved again. Out on the tarmac roads, the airport kept breathing. An engine somewhere. A distant reverse alarm. No one yet had fully understood that the Lufthansa building had been emptied at gunpoint. Then the pressure shifted. One of the employees managed to place a call after the crew had left him behind, bound but not silenced enough. The breach between building and police began to close. That was the complication that mattered. Not sirens in earshot yet, but the knowledge that the warning had started travelling. The response was immediate. Finish the load, leave what could not be moved in a single pass. Get out. A robbery like this does not end when the bags hit the vehicle. It ends when the crew stops being visible as a crew. Status check. The money was out. The airport perimeter still had gaps. Minutes remained. Beat 4. The vehicle pulled away from the cargo building and into the roads feeding out from Kennedy. The men inside sat with guns and canvas and the smell of paper money. Somewhere behind them, the first layers of response were beginning to form. Calls, descriptions, roadblocks preparing to exist. The action after the action had already been planned. The van would be ditched. Another car would take over. People and property would separate, then recombine later under safer conditions. This is the part many robberies lose. The score is won in the building and lost in the hour after. The complication was not police at the bumper. It was human weakness in the cleanup. The van, once it served its purpose, became a problem nobody wanted to keep. The decision was made to hand that problem to Parnell Edwards, known as Stacks, a man trusted with one task. Take the van, dump it, burn it, remove the most obvious trace tying the crew to the airport. Status check. The robbery itself had worked. The crew was out with millions. The van was supposed to vanish before daylight. It was done, but the plan could not hold. The floor activated in the dark after the hard part had already succeeded. Stacks did not destroy the van at once. Whether he slept, delayed, drifted, or believed there was still time, the result was concrete. The vehicle remained where it could be found, intact enough to talk. The realization came not in the cargo terminal, but among the men who learned the van had not disappeared. A successful robbery can survive noise, surprise, even bad luck. It does not survive evidence left in plain sight by one of its own. The response was split and immediate. Some men moved to distance themselves. Some pushed to move the money faster before the failure spread. Jimmy Burke moved the other way. Loose ends were no longer loose, they were hazards. The irreversible point followed quickly. Stacks was killed. So were others connected, directly or loosely, to the job. The money that had brought the crew together now forced it apart. The score had been made. Trust had not. When the investigators arrived, the first strong thread was waiting for them in metal and upholstery. The van was found in Brooklyn. It still held traces from the robbery, coffee cups, fingerprints, the stale smell of an enclosed vehicle that had not been cleaned in panic because panic had arrived too late. Detectives leaned into the open doors and saw not just a vehicle, but the mistake the robbers had left sitting at curbside. The implication tightened the field at once. This was not a phantom crew passing through New York for one night. This was local, connected, men who thought they could clean up later because they believed the city still belonged to them after dawn. The response was to press the known edges. Associates were watched, airport employees were examined. The inside man theory, always present, hardened into direction. The second evidence reveal came from pressure, not from a room. Louis Werner, the cargo employee whose debts had made him useful, became the weak point again. Investigators worked at him through what they already knew and what they could place around him. Airport access, schedules, the sequence of the night. Men like Werner can hold when there is still a chance the larger machine will protect them. They loosen when the bodies start dropping and the machine looks hungry. He gave investigators the line they needed, not the whole truth at once, not the clean version crime stories prefer, but enough. Enough to connect the airport to the crew around Burke, enough to turn suspicion into a case. The response widened from cargo workers to organised crime figures tied to the robbery, surveillance deepened, grand juries moved. What had begun as a night job in a freight terminal became a map of loyalties breaking under federal light. In the years that followed, the Lufthansa Heist did not resolve in one courtroom moment. Several participants and associates were murdered before they could be tried for their parts, many of them killed by men connected to the same crew that had carried off the money. Werner was convicted for his role in setting up the robbery. Jimmy Burke was never convicted of the Lufthansa robbery itself. Though he was later sentenced to prison for murder and died there, a large portion of the cash and jewellery was never recovered. The missing money became part of the case, spoken of as if it had dissolved into bars, racetracks, debt, panic, and graves. The robbery entered crime history not only because of the amount taken, but because the operation succeeded at the airport and failed everywhere afterward. The building was beaten, the crew was not. The final image is not the vault opening. It is the abandoned van in the morning cold, parked on a Brooklyn street, holding the first proof that the score had already started to kill the men who made it. After the van was found, the case changed texture. Until then, the robbery had the clean shape of a successful operation. Men enter, men control the room, money leaves, the airport is beaten before it can answer. But a vehicle abandoned in Brooklyn is not a clean shape. It is a loose thread with grease on it, parked under daylight, waiting for a detective to open the door and breathe in the mistake. From that point forward, the Lufthansa heist belonged to two clocks at once. The official one was kept by investigators, interviews, warrants, surveillance, names moved from rumour to paper. Faces that had once existed only in bars and social clubs began to appear in lineups and files. The other clock was kept by the men around the robbery itself, and it moved faster. Federal cases take time. Paranoia does not. Jimmy Burke understood that difference better than most. He had built crews before. He knew what money does when it arrives in a quantity too large to hide and too tempting to leave untouched. A robbery can be planned in detail. The aftermath almost never can. Men spend when they are told not to spend. They talk when they are told not to talk. They show up wearing the score. That problem emerged quickly. New cars, expensive clothes, gifts. The visible signs that should never appear after a job like this started appearing anyway. Not all at once, not in one foolish parade, but in pieces. Enough to irritate the man who needed silence more than celebration. Then the bodies began to accumulate around the edges of the heist. A bartender with ties to the crew was killed. Martin Krugman, who had helped connect Werner to the men who could use him, was murdered. Stax Edwards, who failed to dispose of the van, was already gone. Others with connections to the operation or with reasons to know too much disappeared or were found dead. Each death had its own setting, its own immediate explanation, its own local violence. Taken together, they formed a second crime wrapped around the first one. The robbery had succeeded. The cleanup was becoming an execution list. Investigators could see the pattern without being able to stop it in time. They were not watching a single theft anymore. They were watching a conspiracy consume its own witnesses before testimony could harden. That gives the Lufthansa case its particular feel. The vault job was sharp, fast, efficient. The aftermath was wet, messy, and driven by fear that never needed to announce itself in public because the men involved already understood the grammar of it. Henry Hill would later provide one of the most famous windows into that world, though not as the architect of the robbery. He described the atmosphere around Burke after Lufthansa as tightening, suspicious, lethal. As he later recounted, men connected to the score kept turning up dead. The story that entered popular culture through later books and films carries that sense of suffocation because the historical case does too. Once the money was out of the airport, the danger did not recede. It moved inward, and the stolen wealth itself kept slipping away from the record. The official total has long been framed at roughly $5 million in cash and jewellery, a sum that in 1978 landed with unusual force. Cash shipments of that size made the cargo vault at Kennedy an intersection between legitimate commerce and criminal attention. Once removed, the money did not sit neatly in a central stash waiting to be recovered. Some of it was spent, some fenced, some passed through hands that never appeared in court. Some likely vanished into the ordinary erosion that follows large robberies, where every intermediary takes a cut and every every cut becomes harder to trace than the original theft. That is one reason the case lingers so strongly. Huge robberies often promise a satisfying image at the end. Stacks of bills on an evidence table, display cases recovered, defendants lined up under flash photography. Lufthansa does not quite offer that, it offers the opposite. An operation big enough to enter legend and then a widening zone of absence. Missing money, missing jewelry, missing witnesses. A central figure never convicted of the robbery itself. Burke remained the gravitational center of that absence. He was suspected, watched, named by informants. Yet the Lufthansa robbery never closed around him in court the way investigators wanted. He would eventually be convicted in another case, the murder of Richard Eaton, and sent to prison for a long sentence. That is a legal ending, but not the neat legal ending this robbery seemed to demand. He died in prison years later, carrying the case with him, but not resolving it. For Werner, the inside man, the path was clearer and smaller. He had been the breach through which the whole operation entered the airport. The weakness that made him useful made him disposable too. He was convicted for his role. In crimes like this, the inside man rarely keeps the glamour attached to the outer ring. He keeps the blame and the exact detail of how the first door opened. The airport itself absorbed the event and moved on, because airports have no choice. Freight still had to move, aircraft still landed, men still pushed dollies through hard light at 3 in the morning. But after Lufthansa, the idea of the cargo terminal as a soft place, an in-between place, had been shattered. A vault attached to global air traffic turned out to be reachable if the right debtor talked to the right men. That operational lesson is part of the case's residue. Not just that organised crime could touch a shipment of extraordinary value, but that the weak point was not a safe-cracking miracle or a military assault. It was a worker under pressure, ordinary infrastructure, and a crew willing to move with speed once the internal map was handed over. The vault was beaten before the first gun was shown, because its sequence had already been sold. And then there is the emotional residue, which is harder to catalogue and harder to shake. The Lufthansa heist begins with an image that invites admiration of control. A freight vault at Kennedy, winter night, a crew taking exactly what it came for. But it ends with evidence left behind and then with silence enforced by murder. The job itself promises one kind of story, the aftermath insists on another. That tension is why the case still holds. It gives the listener the mechanical pleasure of watching a plan work, and then denies the comfort of a clean escape. Even now, the case keeps one of its strongest details in simple contrast. Inside the cargo building, money meant for international transit was stacked under fluorescent light, counted, logged, waiting for movement. A few hours later, men tied to that same movement were vanishing into cars, apartments, bars, and graves, carrying portions of it with them. The amount stolen made headlines. The abandoned van told the truer story.